What we have here is a 1973 Monarch 125 with the GS engine. Monarch was a famous Swedish motorcycle company that won the Motocross World Championship a couple of times in the late 50s, early 60s. And this one here is a model they came out with in 1972. Actually, they introduced it to the US late in 72, and it immediately dominated the 125 class and the 100cc class. This one here was made famous by my buddy Scott Wallenberg. They used his name and photo in an advertisement called Out of the Box Winner. And he went to Byron Motorsports Park in Byron, Illinois, and immediately won his first race. And they used that photo in magazine ads for a number of years and really put the bike on the map. These things were imported into the US from about late 72 till about 74. The GS model was a very limited model and extremely rare. So I'm really happy to have this thing. I raced one of these myself back in the day. I had two of them actually, a 100cc version and a 125. And I really loved the bike, and I'm happy to have another one. The reason this bike dominated the 125cc class and the 100cc class at the time was all the other bikes were much heavier. This one had a chrome moly frame and a real short wheelbase, and it was really nimble handling. And the Pentons and the Sachs and DKW bikes at the time were kind of heavy, had a similar engine. And then the Honda CR150 Elsinore came out in 74. It was introduced late 73 as a 74 model. And after that, these bikes were kind of relegated to, also rans. But that's the story behind it. It was a dominant force for a couple of years, and then it faded quickly. So they're not making motorcycles anymore. When the Honda CR125 Elsinore came out in late 73 as a 74 model, it immediately dominated the 125 class. The reason being, it was a super lightweight bike, and believe it or not, it was Honda's first two-cycle engine. So it was extremely light. They had magnesium engine cases, magnesium hubs, and one of their ads showed a guy hanging the bike from his arms, like lifting the bike off the ground with two hands. It was, I think, 169 pounds, something like that, dry, or 170 pounds. Now, this is the 75 model. It was pretty much a carryover model from the 74. The 74 had green down the tank and green on the number plates, and they just changed it up to look more like the factory race bikes, which had red and silver at the time. So this one's fully restored. I did the restoration on this one, and everything's rebuilt, and it's like brand new. What we've got here is the very first monoshock YZ100. This is a 1977 model. The YZ125 came out in late 75 as a 76 model, and when they improved the 125 for 77, they essentially used the same previous year's bike and sleeved it down to 100cc. So essentially, this is the previous year's YZ125, but this is a 77 YZ100. This bike is completely original, down to its original tires, original hand grip, original seat cover. Everything on here is original and unrestored. This one, incidentally, is also signed by Brock Glover, the former factory Yamaha rider back in this era. Beautiful bike, and it's probably one of the finest examples of original equipment you'll ever find. Real trick aluminum gas tank. The monoshock was up under the tank here with the trellis style swing arm there. And this was Yamaha's first long travel rear suspension, which kind of set the world on fire when it first came out. This is a 79 Husqvarna CR250 motocross bike. The Swedish Husqvarna motorcycle was a very high quality bike. Chrome moly chassis, the aluminum gas tank that had the nice TIG weld down the middle. Everything on this bike was just handcrafted and very quality, refined looking of the day. This model came stock with the Öhlins shocks and with a remote reservoir and nitrogen charged, and it was a 6-speed close ratio transmission. The fork legs were magnesium. They were really trying to keep up with the Japanese that had put millions of dollars of development into the motorcycles to try to take over the motocross market from the European manufacturers who had been doing it from the 60s. and even before that, I guess. So this was a really great effort from Husqvarna, and it was a great bike in the day. And I'm really happy that I've got this one. I paid $220 for it, and it was sitting in a pile of snow in Union, Illinois, and I rescued it in mid-January. And John Lefevre at Vintage Husky did the restoration on this one, and his work is outstanding, and love the bike. This is a 1978 KTM 250 MC5. KTM won the World Championship of Motocross and the European Enduro Championship in 1977, and this was kind of like their flagship model, and this one is entirely original down to its original tires. It does have different handlebars on it, but everything on this other than the handlebars is all original tires. It's probably been ridden about 4 or 5 hours. I rode it when I first got it last year, and it's just a beautiful example of late 70s technology. It still had the twin shock and the air-cooled engine and drum brakes, which all eventually went away. But really high horsepower bike, magnesium engine cases, very light. When the MC5 came out in 1976, that was really what changed their stature in the competition. Was they lightened the bike a lot, and it was all of a sudden super competitive. They've always had horsepower. Prior to 77 in the US, at least on the eastern part of the United States, these bikes were known as Pentons. John Penton made a deal with KTM to build bikes for the US market, and eventually KTM took that over. The Penton Story is an interesting movie. It's available on Amazon, and there's also a book called The Penton Story. But interesting deal, and KTM is now a real force in motocross, so long history. What we've got here is a 1980 RM100. In the early days, the 100cc bikes were full-size bikes based on a 125. So later on in the mid-80s, they became mini cycles. So they were kind of like a downsized, basically a punched out 80cc bike. So they were still, you know, undersized and made for small kids. But in the original days, from the 70s up into this model, 1980, they were full-size bikes with 21-inch front wheels, 18-inch rear wheels. This bike here was a lightly restored, a very original bike. Did a light restoration on it, and I got this from my buddy Tony in McHenry. And it's a great bike, and it's got a lot of original parts on it, all original plastic and fenders and original front tire, original shocks and everything. So it's at a light restoration, and it's a very original piece. These things were really rocket ships in the day. You could really fly off the jumps and stuff. The RM was kind of revolutionary when it came out and dominated the sport for a number of years. So a pretty good example here. This is Honda's very first open class motocrosser, the CR450R. This came out in 1981, and it had a power band like a light switch. It was like all on or all nothing. So it was actually kind of a scary bike to ride, and it really didn't get good reviews in the magazines. But you know, Honda did really well with this bike as a factory bike, and it's a really good example. This one here, it's mostly original. Had just a light restoration on the engine, completely rebuilt, and pretty much everything else is all original. We've got the warning labels. There's one sticker that's missing here, and the goofy thing about this bike is the front number plate looks like it's bent forward, and apparently this was the first year they went to water cooling on the 250s, and they shared this number plate with the 250. So it's got this number plate kind of angled forward for airflow to the radiator on the 250. However, this is an air-cooled bike, and there is no radiator on this, but looks kind of goofy, probably the ugliest front number plate ever put on a dirt bike, and this one still has the original one, so pretty cool bike. This is a Penton Mint 400, a very desirable bike. 400 cc's, 6-speed transmission. These things really hauled the mail. They were real popular in desert racing and somewhat in motocross, but they would fly across the desert, had really great suspension, the magnesium engine that was built by KTM, and these bikes later on were known as KTMs, but in the early years, John Penton, an American, actually helped design the bikes, and they were called Pentons. So this is a real fine example, 1975 model. The rims on this are High Point rims. They're actually made by Sun Metal Company, and they were sold in the Penton accessory catalog as the High Point line of replacement wheels. So these were the shoulderless wheels that wouldn't catch mud. These bikes originally had the shouldered Acront rims, which would catch mud, and these American-made Sun rims were an accessory back in the day. So it's a period-correct modification. It's got an aftermarket silencer on it, which was common back then, and the original Magura controls and everything. Really a nice bike. Marzocchi shocks on the back along with the Ceriani front forks. And these bikes came with Metzler tires, and that's what this one's got. What we've got here is a CZ250. And this is not an original restoration. It's more like a resto mod, like a hot rod race bike that you could vintage race. So one of the modifications they did back in the day was they did this porcupining of the head, and that took some weight off of the engine and also added more edge area to the fins for heat dissipation and so forth. CZs were well known as really a durable bike, had really good durable gearboxes, and were very reliable. They were built in the Czech Republic, and really a little bit on the crude side compared to the Husqvarna models, but very effective in motocross. Won numerous world championships in the late 60s, early 70s. So this is kind of a period correct race version. Back in the day, they would put a Mikuni carb instead of the Czech-made Zhikov carburetor. They'd put plastic fenders in the shoulderless aluminum rims. A few aftermarket parts here with like an aluminum brake pedal to take away the weight of the stock steel one. The aluminum tank like the factory race bikes had, and pretty good representation of kind of a hot rod CZ race bike. My very first motorcycle that I ever owned was a Puch similar to this one. This is a 175cc version. I had the 125 version like the one next to me here, but the 175 Puch was a great bike. There was a 175cc class here around the Midwest, and this thing along with the Bultaco 200s were kind of the dominant force in that class. This particular model came out in late 74 as a 1975 model here in the US. They were noted because they had a factory downpipe, and the previous Puchs had a pipe that ran up the side of the bike and a much more squared off gas tank. A really great bike, and in 1975 Puch won the 250cc World Motocross Champion, and they were one of the largest manufacturers of two-wheeled vehicles in that time in Europe. They sold their scooter line to the Italians later on, and they're still in business. I think they build the G-Wagon for Mercedes, believe it or not. So Steyr Daimler Puch is the name of the company, and they were big into dirt bikes back in this day, and a dominant force, especially in the World Motocross series. And I'm really proud to have owned one of these. That was my first bike, and I've got a love for these bikes, so nobody else seems to care about them, unfortunately. This is a 1974 Ossa Phantom. These bikes were built in Spain, and the beauty of these things was they were ultra lightweight when they came out. The lightest 250 on the market, 190 some pounds, aluminum swing arm, a really fast engine, wide power band, and just a phenomenal motocross machine. They did really well, and they had a very limited amount imported to the United States, so pretty rare piece here. This is a Montesa. Montesa was made in Spain, and they were a really high quality Spanish bike, had beautiful paint jobs on the gas tank. The main feature that was kind of iconic was the cylinder head had wrinkled fins, so the fins had that waviness to them. It gave it more surface area for cooling. And this one has magnesium Marzocchi forks, which were factory option back in 1977-78. This is a 78 model called the VB250 Cappra. Really high quality bike. They had a real radically mounted, forward mounted rear shock absorber for extremely long travel suspension, and really good bikes.